Ladies and gentlemen, welcome. My name is John Hamre. I'm the president here at CSIS, and I just had a huge faux pas. I greeted Senator Kyl at the door, and I said, "Wow, we got a huge crowd for you." And he said, "Well, like, that was an embarrassing thing to say." I said, "No, it was the short notice that we had, and delighted that we did have a chance." Will, come on up here. I've got a seat right up for you up here. Former Deputy Secretary of Defense. We got to stick together, us former deputy guys here, okay? Please. Absolutely. I'm delighted that you're all here today. This is really came up fast, and I'm delighted we had this opportunity. Senator Kyl, of course, is one of the great intellectual leaders in the Senate. I mean that seriously. I was on the receiving end of some pretty tough lectures, but I was always impressed at how he was prepared to work with me, and he did. And this was when the senator, quite ahead of anybody else in the Senate, devoted considerable intellectual energy and personal energy on the issue of counterintelligence, and really was the pioneer behind the counterintelligence executive, the position that was created and has done so much, I think, for this country, and then working on cybersecurity issues. So that's how I first got to know Senator Kyl. Since that time, I've found him to be one of the most diligent and creative intellects working on security issues for this country. And I'm not saying this just to dig out of the hole I dug for myself on the way in the door this morning, but because seriously, it's been my rich experience working with this man. So he's a national leader that we need to listen to, and I'm delighted he could come here today on one of the most topical and important issues of the day. And it's how do we strike this balance in America between protecting ourselves and using techniques that worry people. And of course, the senator is a lawyer, so he's got experience. He knows the depth of complexity that's involved with an issue like this, and yet comes at it with a passion to protect this country. So I thank you, Senator. Delighted to have you here. We're glad you got back through the snow.
Thank you very much. I told John, by the way, the reason that John was a little red-faced is, boy, I'm really surprised we have such a good crowd here today for you. The snowstorm created no small amount of anxiety, both with my staff and also the folks at U.S. Airways, who weren't quite sure that there was going to be a flight that would get me back here this morning. So I was trying to figure out who could actually present these remarks. I also wondered whether they were really necessary, given the erudition of this audience. And then I watched the Sunday morning talk shows and concluded, yes, we need to repeat some of what has already been said in order that the understanding be spread. And so I want to talk today about this surveillance program. We'll call it the NSA surveillance program, and why it is an indispensable tool, why it is legal, and some ways that we can improve the way that we deal with the program. And start with the story that many of you are familiar with. Some say is apocryphal, but it's a story which intelligence historians continue to debate. Concerns the German bombing of Coventry, England, in the fall of 1940, during the height of Hitler's efforts to bring England to its knees. It's claimed that Churchill received top intelligence derived from the Anglo-American breaking of the German Enigma code, which indicated that Coventry would be hit later in that particular day. Churchill faced a choice: either evacuate Coventry and risk revealing that the Enigma code had been broken, or sit on the information at the cost potentially of thousands of lives. He decided to put the city's emergency services on alert, but took no further action. Coventry was sacrificed, but the Germans had no hint that their code was compromised. Now, as I said, historians now aren't sure whether the story is true or apocryphal, but in either event, I think it is telling, because it demonstrates the preeminent value that we place on operational intelligence in war. Churchill was not criticized for his decision, which I think illustrates the mindset that we expect wartime leaders to have. We are in a protracted struggle with an enemy whose ambition is simple: kill Americans by the millions and try to destroy our way of life. The DNI, Ambassador Negroponte, put it this way: attacking the United States homeland, the United States interests overseas, and United States allies, in that order, are al-Qaeda's top operational priorities. The group will attempt high-impact attacks for as long as its central command structure is functioning. And affiliated groups are capable of furthering its interests because even modest operational capabilities can yield a deadly and damaging attack. This is an enemy, of course, that wears no uniform. It can hide among our population for years, as did some of the 9/11 hijackers. Coordinating and financing its mass casualty attacks sometimes requires contact with their sources abroad. And it is in this situation that their requirement of communication provides us with important intelligence opportunities. We appreciate the fact that in the war against these terrorists, it is not usually airplanes and ships and tanks that will provide the victory, but rather good intelligence. And that's where this NSA terrorist surveillance program comes into play. It is necessary, and Americans do expect their government to protect them in this way. Let me provide some testimony first from the Attorney General, then Director Mueller, and then DD&I Hayden. The Attorney General said it's hard to imagine a president who would not elect to use these tools in defense of the American people. In fact, it would be irresponsible to do otherwise. The terrorist surveillance program is both necessary and lawful. Mueller. Leads from that program have been valuable in identifying would-be terrorists in the United States, individuals who were providing material support to terrorists. And here's what General Hayden had to say. Had this program been in effect prior to 9/11, it is my professional judgment that we would have detected some of the 9/11 al-Qaeda operatives in the United States, and we would have identified them as such. Now, this program includes a number of key protections, and it's important to focus on those as we begin discussing it. First of all, as you've heard, it intercepts only international communications, and one of the participants must be a known or suspected member of al-Qaeda or an affiliate organization. It's closely targeted. It is not a drift net to grab conversation and sort it out by keyword searches. The U.S. identities are removed when they are not essential to understanding the intelligence reports. Presidential reauthorization is required approximately every 45 days. And as has been noted, leaders of the House and Senate and the two intelligence committees have been continually briefed. In addition, the Attorney General noted that in his testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee that the Inspector General review has been extensive. Now, there are three primary arguments that are being advanced by opponents of the program, and that's what I'd like to discuss today. The first of the arguments is that the program is illegal under current law. And this requires an examination of two documents, the Constitution and the authorization of military force. Under Article 2 of the Constitution, as the Attorney General testified, there is authority for the Commander-in-Chief. And in the Department of Justice letter to the Congress detailing the legal arguments for the President's authority, let me quote in this respect. Under Article 2 of the Constitution, including in his capacity as Commander-in-Chief, the President has the responsibility to protect the nation from further attacks, and the Constitution gives him all necessary authority to fulfill that duty. They then cite the prize cases going back to 1863, stressing that if the nation's invaded, the President is not only authorized but bound to resist by force without waiting for any special legislative authority. That's from the cases. And here's what Judge Silverman said in a concurring opinion in a 2000 D.C. Circuit case. The prize cases stand for the proposition that the President has independent authority to repel aggressive acts by third parties even without specific congressional authorization, and courts may not review the level of force selected. Of course, it is repeatedly noted that if we're talking about force, implicit in that is the ability to try to determine through intelligence what the enemy's up to without the use of force, or as a prelude to using force. And the fact that Congress passed FISA in 1978 does not erase this constitutional authority of the President. Here's what the Attorney General said in his testimony. The FISA Court of Review, the Special Court of Appeals charged with hearing appeals of decisions by the FISA Court, stated in 2002, quote, "We take for granted that the President does have that inherent authority, and assuming that is so, FISA could not encroach on the President's constitutional power." It's long been recognized that the President's constitutional powers include the power to conduct warrantless surveillance aimed at detecting and preventing armed attacks on the United States. Presidents have repeatedly relied on this power to gather intelligence, and the courts have long upheld that authority. The President noted that during the the Attorney General noted that during the Clinton administration, Deputy Attorney General Jamie Gorelick testified before Congress in 1994 that the President has inherent authority under the Constitution to conduct foreign intelligence service searches, even, that's my words, of the private homes of U.S. citizens in the United States without a warrant, and that such warrantless searches are permissible under the Fourth Amendment. Here's what the Attorney General said. The NSA's terrorist surveillance program fully complies with the Fourth Amendment, which prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures. The Fourth Amendment has never been understood to require warrants in all circumstances. He cites a whole series of cases that stand for that proposition and concludes, moreover, the Fourth Amendment does not require application of a probable cause standard in this context. The reasonable grounds to believe, which are what is used in the program, standard is the traditional Fourth Amendment probable cause standard. So first, the President relies upon his inherent constitutional authority, which has been upheld by the Supreme Court, by the FISA Court, and applied by previous presidents. The second basis upon which the President supports his program is the congressional authorization of the use of military force, the so-called AUMF of September 18, 2001. The Attorney General, in his testimony before the Judiciary Committee, described the importance of the congressional action. He said, first, it expressly recognized the President's authority under the Constitution to take action to deter and prevent acts of international terrorism against the United States. So the first thing that our authorization of force did was to recognize the President's inherent authority. Second, it supplemented that authority by authorizing the President to use, and these are the quotes, to use all necessary and appropriate force against those nations, organizations, or persons he determines planned, authorized, committed, or aided the terrorist attacks in order to prevent further attacks on the United States. And the Attorney General concluded by saying, accordingly, the President's authority to use military force against those terrorist groups is at its maximum because he is acting with the expressed authorization of Congress. And that has to do with the so-called Jackson standard in the steel seizure cases, in which the court laid out a test for examining whether or not the President's action would be appropriate. The first question was whether or not Congress had actually acted in the area. The Attorney General also said this, that in examining the authority under the statute, under the authorization of military force by the Congress, the Supreme Court in the Hamdi case has examined that authority and found it to be wide-ranging and constitutional. The Attorney General said there's no question. Let me back up. Remember, the Hamdi case had to do with the President's authority to detain an American citizen as an enemy combatant during the duration of the hostilities. And the Supreme Court confirmed that the expansive language of the AUMF, all necessary and appropriate force, ensures that the congressional authorization extends to traditional incidents of waging war. And just like the detention of enemy combatants approved in Hamdi, the use of communications intelligence to prevent enemy attacks is a fundamental and accepted incident of military force. And ask yourself the question, if implicit, and this is what the Supreme Court said, implicit in the broad language of the authorization to use military force is the authority to go kill people. If that is authorized, surely the intelligence, which listens to them first, should be included within that authorization. As I said before, history is replete with presidents using the authority that they have under the Constitution. The Attorney General noted several, including the attack on Pearl Harbor, where President Roosevelt authorized the interception of all communications traffic into and out of the United States. And of course, the surveillance program is far more focused, since it involves the interception only of international communications that are specifically linked to al-Qaeda. The second argument that is made by opponents of the program after saying that it's illegal is to say, well, FISA is the sole authority for the surveillance, and therefore FISA either has to be used or it has to be amended. Now note that this argument explicitly rejects the inherent constitutional authority, so it's already flawed, basically. But let's examine the premises of this second argument. First of all, as the Attorney General noted in his testimony, FISA allows for changes as authorized by statute. And the authorization for use of military force provides that authorization. The Attorney General testified as follows. FISA allows Congress to respond to new threats through separate legislation. FISA prohibits persons from intentionally engaging in electronic surveillance under color of law except as authorized by statute. For the reasons I've already discussed, the AUMF provides the relevant statutory authorization for the terrorist surveillance program. Hamdi makes clear that the broad language in the AUMF can satisfy a requirement for specific statutory authorizations set forth in another statute. So that's the authority. Now, this enhanced terrorist surveillance program is a unique program, and it's necessary because of the agility and the resourcefulness of the enemy, which is very difficult for FISA to match. The Attorney General was not saying that FISA can't be used or is not appropriate for use in certain situations. It is. But actionable intelligence has a very short life, and there are situations in which FISA may not be appropriate. General Hayden has testified that FISA is in fact poorly suited to the carrying out of the particular kind of program that we're talking about here. Here's what he testified. I don't think that anyone can make the claim that the FISA statute is optimized to deal with or prevent a 9/11 or to deal with a lethal enemy who likely already had combatants inside the United States. The President's authorization allows us to track this kind of call more comprehensively and more efficiently. The trigger is quicker and a bit softer than it is for a FISA warrant, but the intrusion into privacy is also limited. Only international calls and only those we have reasonable basis to believe involve al-Qaeda or one of its affiliates. Now, another argument here is that actually FISA could be used because it has this special 72-hour provision that allows for greater flexibility. Here I want to quote extensively from the Attorney General's testimony because, again, yesterday on the talk shows I saw this point mangled badly. Here's what the Attorney General said. Some have pointed to the provision in FISA that allows for so-called emergency authorizations of surveillance for 72 hours without a court order. There is a serious misconception about these emergency authorizations. We do not and cannot approve emergency surveillance under FISA without knowing that we meet FISA's normal requirements. In order to authorize emergency surveillance under FISA, the Attorney General must personally, and here's the quotation, determine that the factual basis for issuance of an order under FISA to approve such surveillance exists. Thus, the Attorney General continued, to initiate surveillance under a FISA emergency authorization, it is not enough to rely on the best judgment of our intelligence officers. Those intelligence officers would have to get the sign-off of lawyers at the NSA, and then lawyers in the Department of Justice would have to be satisfied that the statutory requirements for emergency authorization are met. And finally, as Attorney General, I would have to be satisfied that the proposed surveillance meets the requirements of FISA. Finally, the emergency application must be filled as soon as practicable, but within 72 hours, and he went on to note how difficult that would be. So, put quite simply, this is not a standard wiretap kind of activity that FISA contemplated back in 1978. It's a much different kind of program. And the problem is that the Attorney General quite probably does not know before the surveillance occurs what he's going to get out of a particular component of that surveillance until he gets it. And yet, under the FISA requirements of the emergency 72-hour provision, he has to certify in advance that he will be able to meet the FISA standard. He can't possibly do that under this particular program. So it limits his flexibility in an unacceptable way. Now, there's a third argument, and that is that maybe it's well, I think almost everybody recognizes the program is essential. Some still contend that it is illegal. Others contend that it is only legal if it's under FISA. There's a third argument that has much more merit, and that is that assuming that the President has the authority to conduct this activity and that it is not violative of FISA. Nevertheless, Congress should have more oversight. And with this, I agree. It is hard, however, to guarantee the necessary operational secrecy in the current political atmosphere. And that's where I think people of good faith have got to approach this question of congressional oversight outside of the political context in which the debate has been occurring. There's a very clear tension between the desire for more oversight and the potential for more unauthorized and harmful disclosure. You have heard the Vice President and others testify about this, or talk about it, rather. In my view, those entrusted with the knowledge of the program must be committed to its protection. And I'm not sure that's true in all cases. Opponents of the program have openly celebrated the leaks that disclosed the program in the first place, and yet they're demanding to be fully briefed on the program. Here's what Senator Patrick Leahy, the ranking Democrat on the Judiciary Committee, said in the Judiciary hearing with the Attorney General, and this is a direct quote. Mr. Attorney General, can you see why I have every reason to believe we never would have found out about this if the press hadn't? Now, there's been talk about, well, let's go prosecute the press. Heavens, thank God we have a press that at least tells us what the heck you guys are doing, because you are obviously not telling us. I don't think we should be celebrating a leak of information that has been so damaging to our intelligence collection capability against a very dangerous enemy. And make no mistake, the leaders of our intelligence community are of the view that this has been extremely damaging. Let me just quote two quick comments. First, by CIA Director Goss. I'm sorry to tell you that the damage has been very severe to our capabilities to carry out our mission. And Ambassador Negroponte. Anytime sensitive sources and methods are revealed in the public domain through press stories or otherwise, that this carries with it the grave danger of prejudicing adversely affecting our intelligence operations, and in many instances lives can be directly at stake. And he goes on to say that in the 9 months that he's been on the job, one of the greatest disappointments that he's had is the degree to which people are willing to talk about classified matters to the media. And he says we've got to bring that kind of activity to a stop. And yet senators who would be briefed on the program, who are demanding to be fully briefed on the program, celebrate the leak of the program. That's the problem with congressional oversight. So what kind of oversight might be both workable and helpful? Well, 3 things have been proposed. I think 2 are not helpful, and I'll discuss the third last. Senator Specter has an idea that we should seek an advisory opinion from the FISA court. This is both unprecedented and unwarranted, in my view. The U.S. Supreme Court would never review such a non-justiciable case. For those non-lawyers, the court in cases like this has a doctrine of justiciability, which contains at least 2 components. One, is there standing? Is there a case in controversy at issue? The court does not render advisory opinions because real cases and controversies can present specific facts which will dictate the outcome of the case one way or the other. And secondly, the Supreme Court ordinarily eschews political questions in situations which are fundamental to the authority of branches of government competing with each other. This is precisely the kind of case in which the court would likely take a pass. And in any event, the court has already, in my view, in the Hamdi case, resolved the issue of constitutionality of activity of this kind under the authority of the President under Article 2. So I don't think that an advisory opinion sought from the FISA court is the answer. Secondly, we could amend FISA. Well, that's easier said than done. And in my view, for the reasons I expressed, it's also unnecessary, as the Attorney General has testified. The President already has authority both under the Congressional Authorization of Force and under Article 2. And in addition to that, if you could just imagine for a moment the kind of program that's involved here, drafting a statute would present the twin problems of either too little or too much, either too general or too specific. You can't describe the program with any particularity, and you can't even be read into the program, and therefore the general description may encompass too many things. And yet if you try to get too specific, you're going to be right down into the weeds of what the program does, and then you might as well simply tell the enemy exactly what's going on. So that's easier said than done. I think there is a middle way here, a way that could provide oversight and yet not reveal details of the program in a way that would harm it. It seems to me that the full House Intelligence Committee and Senate Subcommittee on Intelligence membership could be briefed on a regular basis on a variety of things, which would enable them to judge whether or not the program is going too far and whether it's working, the real oversight function of Congress. In effect, every 45-day or 90-day, whatever the period of time might be, but since the President has to reauthorize it every 45 days, perhaps every 45 days, a sort of after-action report on the previous 45 days. What kind of information might be provided? First of all, is the program being executed as it was intended? In other words, in accordance with the rather detailed guidelines that the Attorney General testified existed. Now, the full membership of the two committees would not have to be briefed on exactly what those guidelines are, because clearly they would get into details about how the program is actually being operated. But they could be briefed on whether or not the program was being executed as it was intended to be. And certainly the so-called Big Eight could go into more detail about the exact operational details of the guidelines. Second, and very importantly, have any U.S. persons been subject to the surveillance under the guidelines who should not have been? In other words, the real question that was asked at the judiciary hearing that I thought required an answer was, how do we know it's not being abused? You can certainly give the President a lot of benefit of the doubt in a situation like this, but it can't be complete. And there ought to be someone helping to decide whether or not the program has gone too far or has been abused. That's a legitimate inquiry for Congress to make in a situation like this. And so you could simply note whether or not there had been instances in which the program had not worked as intended, but had surveilled American citizens inadvertently or inappropriately. Now, how do you know that the report is true? Well, first of all, you can make it under oath. It can be from the Inspector General. I mean, there's a certain point at which you have to trust the information that you're getting, but that obviously would also have to be determined. If there are cases where people were unlawfully surveilled or improperly surveilled, the report could include information about whether there was any actual damage from the occurrence, or it turned out that nobody ever knew about it, only 2 people saw it, and they never did anything with the information or whatever the fact might be. And also, are adequate measures being undertaken to ensure that what occurred before wouldn't occur again? Now, sometimes this could get into the specifics of the operational details of the guidelines, and therefore you might have a point at which you could not brief all of the members of the committee with great particularity, but you could certainly brief the Big Eight in that situation. And in any event, I think the members of the Intelligence Committee could be given a great deal of information on this. For 8 years on my time on the Intelligence Committee, I got a lot of information about a lot of programs, sometimes a lot of specifics about the methods of the operations and sources, but many times it wasn't necessary for me as a member of the committee to know the real detailed specifics of the operational method of collection. It was sufficient that we understand the information that came out of that and some other related information. And so even members of the Intelligence Committee don't need to know every single detail of how a program operates in order to judge whether or not it is being conducted properly or whether there need to be fixes to it. This could be expanded on. My point is simply to illustrate that there is a way for people in Congress who have authority to do something about it if there's a problem, to be advised if the program is going too far. We have provided for the Patriot Act, for example, that there be reports to Congress on a regular basis of whether or not there might have been problems, and if so, what kind of problems, and how many, and the like. And that certainly could be done here as well. So I think that it is not necessary to terminate the program. It is not necessary to declare it illegal. It's not necessary to try to put it before a judge or 2 or 3 district judges, who after all are lawyers, without great experience in this area, except that they have been briefed. Two of them apparently have been briefed into the program. It is important for Congress itself to provide the oversight, not the courts. And the people on the Intelligence Committee have a degree of experience and expertise on this, which could be brought to bear. And notwithstanding the fact that some of them may be a little less committed to secrecy than I would like to see, there are ways to protect the information along the lines that I've suggested here. So I hope that we could consider this kind of middle way. Let me just conclude by quoting from the President. In confronting this new and deadly enemy, here's what President Bush promised. He said, "We will direct every resource at our command, every means of diplomacy, every tool of intelligence, every tool of law enforcement, every financial influence, and every weapon of war to the disruption of and to the defeat of the global terror network." My friends, the terror surveillance program described by the President is one such tool. It's an indispensable aspect of the defense of our nation, and I believe that we need to defend it and find ways to make it work. Thank you. Thank you.
Sure. I want to thank Senator Kyl for making a compelling case for continuing NSA surveillance and for providing us with many of the details that were lacking in the Sunday talk shows this weekend. The Senator has agreed to take some questions, so the floor is open.
Yes, sir.
Senator, you're one of the 537 people in this town that have actually been elected to something. You indicated you were just back in Arizona.
Plus the President and Vice President.
Correct. That's 537.
He was right.
My question is, what are you hearing from your constituents? This has been in the press now for almost 8 weeks. It's received a lot of attention, obviously. And so I'm just wondering, what are your constituents telling you, number one, and number two, what are you hearing from your colleagues about what their constituents are telling them about this issue?
Quite honestly, in the last couple of weeks, in the weekends that I've gone back home, I've spoken to Republican groups at Lincoln Day functions celebrating the birth of the Republican Party, and as you might imagine, most of my Republican constituents are very strongly in support of the President and support of the program. On those occasions where I've spoken more generally to the public, I've still seen that kind of support. I'm aware of polls that suggest that there is a fairly, well, that the public supports the program, but there is some division with respect to their views as to its illegality. And what is troubling to me is that it seems to break very closely along partisan lines, suggesting to me that some of the discussion of this in the media from a partisan standpoint has had an effect, and I lament that. I deplore it, because this should not be the kind of discussion that if we're going to have a constructive solution to it, depends upon information received in a partisan way. Yes, sir.
May I just ask everybody who asked a question to please stand, give your name and identify your affiliation before you ask the question.
Do you believe it's possible for some House Democrats to initiate impeachment over this? Is that feasible in your view?
No.
For what reasons? Because some have talked about it, so that's why I'm asking.
There's no there. There's no reason for impeachment. I'd be happy to give more complete answers to other questions.
Ann Bader, UK Defense Academy. Senator, what, if anything, can you tell us about how our allies are responding to this issue in the press?
I'm sorry, I can't really give you any current information about that. I haven't had conversations recently with foreign leaders or folks who have talked to them specifically on this project. I just can't answer your question.
Can you in any way theorize or give us any sense of what you think of it?
Well, I can speculate a little bit. During my time on the Intelligence Committee, for example, I was very impressed with the degree of cooperation of intelligence services from other countries and the leadership of other countries, many of whom did not support the United States position with respect to the war in Iraq, and yet which cooperated very closely with the United States. Obviously, Great Britain has been our closest ally in this matter, but European allies that did not support the President in Iraq, nevertheless, have been very, very cooperative. And many of their, I mean, they have similar situations to one degree or another. They conduct very robust intelligence in ways that we would find uncomfortable in the United States domestically. But they also have some laws that in some cases needed to be amended right after 9/11 and were. In other cases, sort of like our problem with the Patriot Act laws that ended up not being amended and continue to create some kind of problems. But the good news is that they're all working within the rule of law as we understand it. And it's always important that we bear in mind that there is a critical component to U.S. intelligence gathering, and that is it's got to be constitutional. All of this has to be within the rule of law. And most of our allies that I'm familiar with treat the issue with that same degree of seriousness and yet are very robust in their intelligence collection. So I would assume that they find this activity perfectly appropriate, but I can't say that with authority.
Thank you.
Senator, thanks for a great presentation. Jim
Thank
Longley. You said something that's very important. You said that it's hard to maintain secrecy in the current partisan environment. And given all that we've done post 9/11 and given the ongoing, not just the partisanship, but even the difficulties that the Congress has had grappling with the issues of oversight and reforming oversight, do you see this in any controversy in any way helping push those issues forward in a constructive way?
Until you qualified it with in a constructive way, I was tending to agree. That's the problem. I mean, I'm sure that we have a wide variety of political opinion in the room here today, but just stop and think for a moment. Does it really help to have the discussion put in partisan terms? You had, and I'll be real explicit, you had a lot of Democrats, leaders in the Democratic Party, coming out very early saying that what the president was doing was illegal, that it was criminal activity. Now, these are U.S. senators, Democrats on the Judiciary Committee, who are calling the activity of the president illegal. I mean, in the same sentence, president and illegal. President, criminal activity. You can argue that he does not have the authority that he claims to have. I acknowledge that as a lawyer, you have to have a pretty odd proposition for there not to be two sides that can be argued. And there is a good and legitimate case that can be made on the other side of the argument that I presented here. Why not do it in that way? Why not say we understand that in time of war the president needs to act and needs to act quickly, and we want him to do that which is necessary to protect us. But we question whether this might have gone too far, and then you frame the argument, but you don't come right out and call the president a criminal. That makes it very difficult to arrive at constructive solutions. Likewise, when the ranking member of the Judiciary Committee in effect says, I'm glad the press told us what was going on because you guys weren't going to do so. I mean, implicit in that statement is the notion that it is okay for people to leak this kind of information if that's the only way that Congress is going to get it. A, that doesn't acknowledge that members of Congress did get it, and B, it suggests that that the means justify the ends here, notwithstanding whatever damage might have occurred. That's the kind of partisan rhetoric that doesn't advance a constructive solution. Now, Arlen Specter's proposal is not presented as a partisan proposal. He's a Republican. I disagree with him, but it's a legitimate proposal. Those who have suggested amending FISA have a legitimate argument. I mean, maybe we need to amend FISA. I think I have a legitimate counter. Awfully hard to do in this context. Besides that, I don't think we need to do it. And then those who want congressional oversight fall into two camps, it seems to me. Those who want the oversight in order to engage in an inquiry into the legitimacy of the president's actions, those who might like to end up in a situation where they could file articles of impeachment, versus those who are constructively trying to find a balance, a way of providing congressional oversight that doesn't detract from the value of the program itself or compromise the value of the program itself. I look to these issues as the shoe being on the other foot, with a president who I don't necessarily trust, of a different political party, possibly tempted to use a program like this for other than legitimate reasons. It's quite appropriate to hypothesize that kind of situation. In fact, I think you need to do that in a situation like this and say, would I still be so red hot for the program if I had a fear of that? Because I suspect some of my political opponents have exactly that fear of the current administration. I don't think they should, but they might. And so that is not an illegitimate question, but approach the question then in a constructive, appropriate way, not with the charged rhetoric that makes it very hard to find middle ground, to get reasonable people to come together on a reasonable solution to the problem. I promise next time I won't give quite as long an answer.
I think you're doing fine. Will Taft, Senator, I'm wondering about the extent of the authority that you think the Congress would have in this field if it chose to exercise it. The President makes a large claim for the Commander-in-Chief authority. The necessary and proper clause would seem to apply to the Commander-in-Chief authority and all authority granted to anybody. I wonder how you see that and whether you think Congress will be exercising more authority here.
Will, thanks for the question, because it gives me an opportunity to make this very important point. There is no answer to that question. And that's the way our founders set it up. They set up theoretically, although they didn't know it at the time, they thought it only applied to 2 of the 3 branches, but the 3rd branch quickly decided it applied to them too. They set up an absolute authority in all 3 branches, at least 2 of the 3, and it's come to be known in the 3rd, the judiciary as well. In a situation where you would have, it was inevitable that you would have absolute authority, Article 1, conflicting with absolute authority, Article 2, carried to its extreme. What limit is there on Article 2? It's hard to find any limit that Congress could place on Article 2 that isn't placed on the executive by other provisions of the U.S. Constitution. Does that mean there aren't any? I don't think so. I think there could be a point at which, I mean, this is the war powers debate, but it illustrates the point perfectly. Are there any limits to Congress? In other words, can the Congress simply say, Mr. President, this is the authority you'll have, and it is only the authority you'll have, period, period? Well, Congress ought to be pretty explicit in a lot of this area. It ought to legislate. It's better if we have laws on the books that provide the guidance for the executive on these things. It's really important for Congress to work in this area in a deep way. But can it preclude the President? No. And so how do we resolve these issues? By reasonable people sitting down after the rhetoric cools a little bit and deciding that your authority is absolute, my authority is absolute, now let's work this out. Or the 3rd branch might try to resolve it. But even that branch is very careful to say, we don't think in this case we have a controversy, or we think there's a political question, so we're not going to get to it. In our history, one of the great chapters of our history has to do with the way that the 3 branches have stepped right up to the brink in asserting their authority and then backing down ever so slightly to accommodate the reality that we all need to work together on these important problems. The War Powers Act said Congress has the authority. We're going to tell the President how he can act, and this is the only way he can act because under the Constitution we have the power to declare war. And so he's not going to be able to use military force except by the way that we authorize it. All presidents, Democrat and Republican, have said thank you for that advice, but I don't have to take it. And then what do? They all try to get some kind of authority. They are much more comfortable acting with that authority, and we're much more comfortable having them act with that authority. And so we never quite resolve the question that you asked, is the authority absolute? There is no right answer to that question, certainly not in the hypothetical. And that's okay if you have reasonable people in all 3 branches of the government understanding that you may have power, but does it mean that you therefore always exercise it? It's a little bit like, if I can analogize, the filibuster power of judges. The truth of that is, there is a right under the Senate's rules to filibuster that does not appear to be limited to legislative action. The question is whether, since it has never, you can argue maybe once it was, but I'll assert, it has never been asserted that the minority in the U.S. Senate has considered it a wise thing not to assert it for all kinds of practical reasons. So you may have a right, but does it mean that you necessarily assert it? And the president has rights, the Congress has rights, the court has rights, and all three of them have pulled back a little bit from the absolute exercise of those rights at certain times because it was more important to find a functional way to proceed than to assert the absolute right. In one respect, it's a flaw, but I suggest it's a genius of our system, as long as you have good people willing to approach the issues in a serious and responsible way.
Senator, I want to thank you for a very sophisticated analysis of this. But the question I'm going to ask is probably a lot less sophisticated. Is this a tempest in a teapot, or is this really a major national issue? And how I'm going to ask you the question is this. In this administration, how many times has this been used? 50, 500, 5,000, or 50,000? Because the more zeros you add, the more concerned I become.
I think it is a very big deal. Because it implicates one of the most fundamental constitutional issues that we have, the one that Will Taft just asked about. How far does the president's authority go? Is it absolute? How far does Congress's power go? Is it absolute? What about the 9 lawyers sitting on the Supreme Court? Do they have the ability and the right to resolve this issue specifically, definitively, once and for all, and so on? That's a big deal in our country. And how we continue to resolve those issues in an important context like this will determine a lot about the continuing success of this great experiment in, as Abraham Lincoln called it. Also, the war on terror is hugely important. It's hard to overstate, in my view, the importance of dealing with this enemy. And apparently this program is really important to the success of our war on terror. And so from all three standpoints, I think this is not a tempest in a teapot. It is very important, and we have to try to get it right, which is why we have to approach it from a reasonable standpoint and not a political standpoint. With regard to how many times it's been used, I suspect that that's the wrong way of looking at the program, and that's part of the problem. This is not a traditional wiretap kind of program that was envisioned by FISA. This is a different construct, and we can only imagine what it is. It's not really data mining, as General Hayden has said. It's something different. So it's not like there are specific incidences in which it is used, or instances that you can put a numerical number on. I mean, I suspect you can quantify it, but I don't think we would quantify it quite in the way that we might think of. So I simply take it as a fact that it is widespread enough that it is that it is more than just a de minimis kind of program, that it is important, that it is broad, and that we do have to get it right. I'll simply stipulate to that going in, and if I'm wrong, then there's no harm. But if we went at it the other way and said this really isn't that worth any kind of effort on our part, then we might be wrong. And I think for the reasons I articulated, it is important that we get this right. But I just hope that we can do it outside of a purely political context, because that's going to make it very difficult for us to make sure that we have it right.
My name is Mike Miyazawa. Since the World War II, the United States has almost always been at war with somebody at some place in this world. And therefore, every president since the World War II has been commander-in-chief at the wartime. May I understand that this kind of warrantless wiretapping is a kind of norm for all the presidents since the World War II?
while it is true that we have been in conflict, and in almost all of the cases there was specific authorization for the use of force coming from Congress, so that it's clear that that both of our policy-making branches of government supported military action. I don't think that a concern about an overly broad use of wiretapping authority is necessarily appropriately drawn from that fact. First of all, FISA was developed to respond to a particular kind of concern about a particular kind of surveillance during the Jimmy Carter era. And I can't recall, other than the Iranian situation, we were at war then. But in any event, the Cold War was going on, and nobody disputed our authority to engage in intelligence, including electronic surveillance in that situation. The real question is whether, when Congress authorizes the use of military force, it has to. The question is, how specific does it have to be about each element of force? And you can look at this two ways. You can say, as one of my colleagues did, we couldn't have imagined that we were authorizing this electronic surveillance program when we passed the authorization of force on September 15th, or 18th, whichever, 18th. Well, at one level, that's probably true. I'll tell you that I didn't have that in mind when I voted that day. But does that mean that it wasn't included? I didn't have in mind detaining people that we captured either. But the Supreme Court said, of course, that's necessarily included within the definition. The fact that we didn't have in our mind all of the specific incidents of authority that we were authorizing does not mean that they weren't authorized. The fact that we used broad language is meant to encompass things that we didn't necessarily think about at the time. And in this case, it could even include things that we don't know about. Frankly, if you put the question to the American people, do you hope that there are some things that our government is doing to fight al-Qaeda that you don't know about, and that even most members of Congress don't know about, so that they couldn't possibly have been specifically thinking about it when they passed the authorization for use of military force? My guess is you'll get a very large majority saying, we sure hope so. We hope our intelligence community is that good. So I don't think it's any argument that the authorization did not explicitly identify. And in fact, I think it would be a mistake. As some of my colleagues have said, well, Congress needs to act. Otherwise, next time we have a problem like this, we're going to want to list every single piece of authority, because otherwise there'll be an implication that exists and we may not want it to. That's a bad road to go down, because you can't possibly think of every single thing that you want to authorize the commander-in-chief to do. It's impossible to anticipate everything, and I hope there are some things he's doing that I don't know about. So we shouldn't have to be that specific. I think the general authorization of force in this kind of situation can be broad. That's why when I say amending FISA will be very, very hard, it's either going to be too broad to suit people. If you have a really broad amendment, then what good is it? What have you accomplished? And if you try to get too specific, A, you're going to probably forget something, and B, you're going to tell the enemy exactly what you're doing. So that's probably not the best way to try to approach the problem. Still, one last question? Mm-hmm. Yes, sir, this gentleman.
Thank you, Senator. To what extent do you think that the judgments about the validity of the intelligence reports on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq have influenced both the impressions of people in Congress and the public at large on this anti-terrorism use of the law?
That's a really good question, and I don't know the answer to the question, but I suspect that there will be some data ultimately provided on that, because it's, I think, an important question. I would speculate the following. First of all, it's interesting to me that there seems to be broad public support for the conducting of the program, and that might suggest that people are not connecting the intelligence failure on the one hand with a potential intelligence problem here. And yet I can look at it the other way and say, I wish that the support for the program were even broader, and quite possibly the degree of political opposition to it and concern on the part of people that aren't even engaged in a political debate, that the failure of intelligence before certainly raises questions about any kind of intelligence operation and the need to have people overseeing it. And so my guess is that there has been some impact simply from the superficial point that intelligence failed over here, so we need to be careful about it over here. However, if you go beneath the superficial, there's no connection at all. In that the intelligence, and I know there's a little dispute about this, but I dispute the dispute, Congress had the same intelligence essentially that the president had. He was given it in a slightly different form, but I was on the Intelligence Committee throughout that period of time. I know what we got. Every intelligence agency in the world that amounted to anything agreed with the United States, and we do know that he had weapons of mass destruction. The real question is what happened to them. He did have them. The problem is the intelligence community was saying right up to the time that we took action he had them, and by then he didn't. They had gone somewhere, and they hadn't figured it out. So there was an intelligence failure to that extent. But I don't think that more congressional oversight really would have necessarily answered that. The intelligence community was very certain about its conclusions, and all of the information they gave us suggested some disputes within the administration, but nothing that would cause anybody to question it to the extent of its underlying assumptions. So I'm not sure that the issues are the same. That was a very bad failure of intelligence. This is a question not of a failure of intelligence, but whether or not we need to have more than one set of eyes looking at it just to make sure that nothing wrong happens. And I think that's a perfectly legitimate question. But let's don't question its illegality or the necessity of the program or the results that come from it. I mean, I think in all three of those cases, the answer is fairly clear. The question that remains is, should we have somebody else looking to make sure that it's not used in an improper way? And I say to that, yes. Now let's sit down and figure out a good way to do that that doesn't compromise the program, make it unworkable, and potentially provide information to the enemy that we don't want provided. I thank you very, very much for your great questions.